They're not lying.
I think it's the African Leadership Center.
It's a real issue, and it's a real problem. In fact, the speech that I gave yesterday referred to this process of globalization. And part of what has happened is that the internet, the global supply chain, has connected the world like never before, which means that if you have a skill that is in high demand, now you have a worldwide market that is interested in your skills. And more and more, not only are we seeing concentrations of wealth, but we're also seeing concentrations of talent in various global centers, right? Whether it's Shanghai or Dubai or, right? And along with that concentration of talent and wealth, then you see concentrations of power that ends up tilting further in the direction of inequality. And I think everybody here is going to have to look inside themselves. There's not going to be a magic answer for how to deal with this, because each individual is going to have to ask themselves, where do they want to make their life? Where do they want to put down their stake? But what I do believe is that if we have African leaders, governments, and institutions that are creating the platform for success and opportunity, then you will increasingly get more and more talent wanting to stay. And once you hit a tipping point, then not only will you start slowing the brain drain, but in fact, it'll start reversing. So the issue then becomes, how do we, for example, create a situation where if you want to start a business, you don't have to pay huge amounts of bribes, or you don't have to be connected with the right family in order to get it going? Or are you able to access credit with relative ease in order to start your nonprofit, right? There are certain things that government can do. I was speaking to this wonderful group, and remind me, Cameroon? Ernest. So Ernest was talking about Cameroon, and there's a civil conflict there. Well, you know, it's harder to get people to stay if there are a bunch of people shooting at each other. So there's some things that government will have to do. But here's one thing I've observed. The amount of impact you can have in your home countries, precisely because there may be less of a concentration of talent. If you're willing to take the risk and undergo some of the challenges and the hardships, your chances, your odds of being transformative, of shaking things up, of helping more people, are going to be higher here than they are in some major world capital. Man, if any of you come to America, you'll do wonderful stuff, but it's less likely that you revolutionize how education is done in America than it is how you revolutionize education in Tunisia. It's less likely that you're going to revolutionize farming in the United States. Farming's already pretty well developed. You know, if you drive through some cornfields in Iowa, they know how to farm. There's a lot of corn there. The problem in places like the United States is not enough food. It's what to do with all the food we've got. But in my father's traditional village in Kenya, a place called Kogelo, where my sister just set up a youth center, You drive by a little hectare of maize, and they're all drooping, and there's one every 2 feet, and it's just wildly inefficient. You go there, and you've got skills and knowledge and technology about how to improve agricultural yields without huge amounts of capital inputs. Suddenly, you can change that whole village, that whole region, that whole country, right? So part of the question I think each of you end up having to ask yourselves is how big are your ambitions? Huh? And I would argue that if you've got really big ambitions, then you're going to stay here. If you want a comfortable life, then obviously there are going to be a lot of takers all around the world. Last point I'm going to make about this, and this goes back to the issue of how it's going to be very hard to separate government and politics from economics and social development. If you create the right conditions and you get that tipping point, then the cultural sense of belonging and ownership that you will feel from that accomplishment, I think, can be satisfying in a way that would be different if you are just doing well someplace else. I think it can affect your heart as well. And one of the things I'm noticing is in China now, if you go to Shanghai or Beijing, a lot of Chinese students who studied in the United States and used to feel as if I want to start a company, I've got to stay in Silicon Valley or Austin, Texas, or Boston. Now they're all like, oh no, I need to get back to Shanghai because that's where things are happening. So if the governments are doing just the bare minimum, just the basics, no shooting, minimize bribes, build some infrastructure and regular electricity, right? I mean, we're not talking about complicated stuff. Then, fairly quickly, you can start seeing things starting to reverse. All right? Excellent question. I got to check to see who's next. Lillian Otisor from Kenya. Habari.
Nzuri sana.
Hey.
So, hi, Mr. President. I'm Lillian from Kenya. I work in HIV. I work for a Kenyan NGO, and we focus on the vulnerable groups and reaching them for HIV and gender-based violence services. Right. My question is, the world is facing a leadership crisis with a lot of hate and negativity. In Africa, our political leaders continue to be greedy, corrupt, and tribal. In some cases, we have used the vote to get fresh, new blood, but they seem to get caught up in the same bad habits. What advice would you give young aspiring leaders who feel disillusioned to participate in politics or other government positions, fearing the negative practices those offices seem to come with and the possibility of selling our souls?
Oh, Lord. When I was mentioning how I started having my early political awakening when I was about your age, maybe around 21, 22, I started to really think, how can I change the world? And I wanted no part of electoral politics. Because my attitude was what you just described. I thought, they all seem kind of slick and phony, and I didn't really trust them. And so what I believed in was social movements. My inspiration was Gandhi and King, and my notion was, how do I mobilize grassroots to put pressure on politicians so they're responsive? and accountable, but not necessarily not wanting to be a politician myself. And so I became a community organizer, and I worked in low-income areas, and so I did a lot of the kinds of work that you are doing now. And the amount of knowledge and love and wisdom that I gained from working at the community level, it transformed me. It made me grow up, made me into a man. But what I noticed was the decisions that were being made were not being made in the local neighborhood where I was working. They were being made someplace else. And so I was constantly thinking, how do I get more levers, more leverage to affect change at the local level? And I started looking at City Hall and how decisions were being made at the city level. Then I started looking at, well, funding for education. That was affected at the state level in America. And then there was a steel plant that had closed, because this is at a time when a lot of manufacturing in America was moving overseas to look for cheaper labor. And those decisions weren't even being made in the city. They were being made in New York by some financiers. And so I thought, okay, I need more knowledge. I need to figure out how I can get more leverage. And I ended up going to law school. Even when I got out of law school, I still was not interested in politics. And I started practicing civil rights law and voting rights law, thinking that a more direct way of change than purely the local level was now to get people mobilized to vote, to impact those decision makers somewhere else. And then it just so happened that there was a seat for a local government office that opened up, and some people said, well, you're talking all the time, Mr. Big Talk. Why don't you try it out? And I did, and I won. And when I reflect back on my career, there was sort of a fork in the road at that point. And all of us in our lives will come to forks in the road where, that way offers a vision of a life that has some pluses and some minuses, and then that fork, same thing. And I took this one. It worked out. I ended up being a fairly successful politician. But there are times where I reflect and say, had I not decided to run, and I had decided to take what I had learned in my law practice, and I'd started building a local organization and trying to scale it up and do more economic development in low-income communities, first in Chicago, and we built a good model, and then I transported that to Los Angeles or New York or other cities, and began to network with people who were doing urban development and poverty alleviation and education programs around the world. I might have had a significant impact that way too. So I guess the point of the story is there's no one way of doing it. I think there are a lot of different ways in which you can effectuate change. The one thing you can't do is pretend that politics doesn't matter and say to yourself, that's too corrupt, that's too broken, I'm not going to get involved in that. Because at some point, if you are ambitious about what you're doing in your home country, you will confront politics. You're going to want to build a center, and now you need approvals in order to get the land, and suddenly the governor decides, what's in it for me? And you're going to have to deal with that. You're going to need some financing. You go to the local bank. Well, suddenly the bank says, who sent you? Right? suddenly politics is mismanaged in your country, and next thing you know, right in the middle of you trying to build your center, there's an ethnic conflict going on, and everything shuts down for 6 months, and your project stops, and because people are scared. Yeah. So you can't avoid government, and you can't avoid politics. And then the question becomes, all right, how do I want to engage it? Do I want to run for office? Some people have the personality and the inclination to do that. Some people don't. You know, they may not want to be the public face of something. Other people will say, okay, I don't want to run, but I think I can help organize and manage the efforts of people who I think are sincere and have integrity. And so they'll be involved in the political world, but in a different way. Some people may say, I don't want to be involved at all in campaigning, but I do want to mobilize people to vote and participate. Some people may be journalists, and they say, my job is to hold politicians accountable and make sure that we're shining a light on how public monies are being spent and how decisions are being made. All that is contributing to the quality of government. And so you don't have an excuse to say, this is too corrupt and I'm going to be selling my soul. Find a way where you're not selling your soul. But you still have to be involved in government and in politics. And look, I don't want to make light of the fact that some countries being involved in politics is dangerous. You know, there's some places where reporting on what's really happening can land you in jail. And I am never going to be somebody who urges people to do things and just ignore the consequences of the decisions. People have families. People, you know, have children. You know, there are risks that each of us have to measure in terms of how far we're willing to go, which is partly why my final piece of advice about politics is do not do it alone. Africa, like a lot of places, has a history of charismatic leaders around which everybody rallies, but not as effective about creating collective organizations and collective leadership. And the problem with charismatic leaders is, A, if they end up not turning out as wonderful as you'd like, things can be worse if they're charismatic and they consolidate power and then they do whatever they want. Problem number two is if they die, now suddenly all the energy that's been built dissipates. Problem number three is governance is not the same as getting elected. And a lot of times somebody who's a charismatic leader may not know how to set up effective schools or properly administer a budget. And so the goal of politics is not just getting elected. The goal is governing in a way that improves people's lives. And that requires a collective. That requires a team with people of different expertise. So as you are thinking about government politics and your role in relation to it, think about how can you find like-minded people whose values you share, whose vision you share, and how can you collectively then start doing the work to bring about changes. And maybe it starts at the local level. Maybe it starts at a regional level as opposed to national right away. Huh? I sure hope, though, you get involved some way. Women in particular, by the way, I want you to get more involved because because men have been getting on my nerves lately. I mean, I just every day I read the newspaper and I just think, like, brothers, what's wrong with you guys? I mean, what's wrong with us? All right, I mean, we're violent, we're bullying, just not handling our business. So I think empowering more women on the continent, that ought to, right away, is going to, I think, lead to some better policies. So, all right. Let's see. Oh, wait. Everybody just stay in your seats. I'm not going to suddenly call on you. Just, okay. This gentleman right here.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. So, His Excellency Julius Bio Maada Bio of Sierra Leone recently appointed me as the country's first Chief Innovation Officer.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And in your presidency, you created and worked with institutions like USDS, Digital Services, and 18F to build institutions that focused on transforming the lives of citizens through technology and innovation, like healthcare.gov, which had challenges, but obviously impacted millions of people. So the question is, for some of us who are thinking about actually doing and driving innovation across and within government for service delivery and citizen engagement and thinking about the ecosystem, what leadership models and advice would you offer to us such that we're able to not only engage the people within government, bring resources from outside, but as you mentioned, work with the fundamental authorizing environments, that is the citizens themselves who will absorb those innovations? Thank you.
Well, I think it's a great sign that your government recognizes the opportunities. And each country here is going to vary in terms of the platforms, the infrastructure that exist. The great thing that we're seeing, all of you know this better than I do, is that here on the continent, and it's similar in parts of Asia, you're leapfrogging all the old legacy technologies that we had to build out in the United States, right? Everybody's laying all these lines and all this stuff, and suddenly here, people are just dropping a bunch of cell towers fairly efficiently, and everybody's got a phone, and in some ways you are ahead of what's happening back home in terms of people seeing the constant day-to-day utility of transactions and communications and banking and all kinds of stuff just off a remote device. So the opportunities, I think, are vast to directly engage with citizens and make sure that they are getting everything they can out of government in an effective and efficient way. In terms of how you organize a team internally, what I've found is that initially, at least, what works best is have a very specific problem that you're trying to solve, rather than bringing together a bunch of people to sit around the room and say, hey, what can we do with neat technology, and doing a bunch of abstract theoretical conceptualization. Instead, think about what are we trying to make sure that our local farmers know their prices for their crops and they can get them to market fairly. And is there a way for us to make sure that that's posted every day so that they are getting full value? Right? That's a very specific problem in which now your technologists can go out with people who are doing agricultural policy sit down with a bunch of farmers, look at who are the middlemen, how's the market working, what are the specific barriers or roadblocks, or what would be the information that would solve the particular problem that small farmer is having. And now, in an iterative fashion, you are designing something for them, right? And then next, okay, on education, how do we? The thing we want to do is we want to make sure that young people who may not have access to enough teachers. So I was mentioning in my father's village, you've got one teacher for every 78 children. That's a lot of kids per child. This is a very rural, remote area. Right? So what are the specific things that we could do to be a force multiplier, to enhance and increase the ability of a teacher? If you can't afford a whole bunch of, the best thing to do obviously would be to hire 5 more teachers. But if you can't do that, are there ways in which we can set up a laptop or an iPad that helps the teacher track student progress in a more efficient way, so at least they can spot who is having trouble with this, arithmetic problem, right? So I think the more you're focusing on specific problems, then I think what you'll discover is you can build out a team fairly quickly. And what I also believe is if your government is clever and willing to throw its weight around a little bit, you will get companies to volunteer, provide a supplementary workforce that will help you solve the problem for free. You mentioned, for those of you who are less familiar with this, I'd won this healthcare battle. We're the only advanced country in the world that really doesn't have universal healthcare. We made a huge stride with this legislation we passed. We had to set up a platform because of procurement issues, and the U.S. government is terrible about buying software. The thing didn't work when it was supposed to. So we had to scramble to fix it. And essentially, we just called up Facebook, Google, Stripe. We had a bunch of friends in Silicon Valley, and we said, send us some engineers to help figure this out. And what you discovered was that in every one of these companies, there are coders, engineers, who are well compensated, are really top of the line in terms of what they do.
All right, we seem to have lost that line, but I'm willing to bet my money on it that President Obama is at the African Leadership Academy in Honeydew, started by a young Ghanaian, exceptional entrepreneur, Fred Swanika, who started it so he could re-engineer how young people look at leadership. He collects young people from all over the continent. If you're a young person and you're doing work, community work, in your community, but also want to take it a step further, you apply to that institution, and he brings them all to Honeydew, and they go through these stages.
And it's produced remarkable South Africans.
And go back to their societies and give back. But this connects very well to President Barack Obama's YALI initiative, the Young African Leaders Initiative. He's taken about 20 South Africans that I know of to that initiative in Washington, where they go there for about a 2-week session and they come back and do amazing work back in the country. So quite a beautiful one. Great.
And it all talks to, it's International Mandela Day today, Nelson Mandela International Day. And Nelson Mandela was very much for the youth and wanted to see them advancing.
Absolutely.
And Barack Obama as well, he was talking yesterday, Barack Obama, about, 100 years ago, many people there who was born in that time never saw the possibility of advancing from their circumstances.
Absolutely.
And as we know that Nelson Mandela did, and so, I mean, the circumstances is different now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Different circumstances, but still, the will to advance is still there in many youth.
It was always going to be that type of show with everything. Today is taken over by International Nelson Mandela Day, and we hope as the day progresses, more amazing stories will be coming up.
I'm sure it will. Stand by. On Point will take you through the rest of the next 3 hours or so. For myself, Blaine Herman.
That's it for us. Desiree Chauke.
Take care.